So today is May 4th, 2017, and before the Western world whips into a frenzy to celebrate the widely misunderstood fiesta of Cinco de Mayo, I thought we might temper their consumer appetite with the stunning data released just this week about consumer credit. Consumer credit being the funds advanced to borrowers for the purchase of goods and services. So just this week, the United States welcomed credit card debt into its esteemed $1 trillion club, joining auto loans and student debt, each of which boasts $1.2 trillion and $1.3 trillion respectively. To put this into perspective, student loan debt averages a near $3,000 uptick every second. Every second. And while we find a plateauing of the quantity of mortgage accounts in the US, we find a dramatic increase of auto loans. And to make things worse, a burgeoning quantity of subprime borrowers, prolonged term durations, and higher loan-to-value ratios, indicating that lenders may be enabling borrowers to finance well beyond their capacity to afford. And while these figures bode well for balance sheet cosmetics, the unfolding quantity of delinquencies demonstrates the dire truth behind blind borrowing. So what does this mean for the economy, and what does consumer credit say about it? Well, as it turns out, the conventional wisdom of mainstream economics has it all backwards. A little bit of historical reverence, if we can call it that, may prove useful in this context. Around the 1930s, in the midst of the Great Depression, one economist rose to prominence to become one of the most influential figures of the 20th century. His name was John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes forever altered the philosophical disposition of political and economic pundits toward business cycles, effectively emboldening them to exercise political clout, to manipulate social behavior, and to propose preemptive or reactive policies to encourage growth in supposed critical industries. Of course, these endeavors rose from extraordinary times, in the midst of economic disrepair, not completely separate from the destruction of wartime, nor independent from government policy. Unfortunately, Keynes was deprived of the eventual words of 1974 Nobel laureate Friedrich von Hayek, who wrote, "The curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they can imagine they can design." End quote. In the form of public opinion and policy formation, the notions of utopia are limitless, scarcely bound by the limits of our physical world, and by these fanciful, palatable intellectual odysseys, we inherently feel fulfilled and levitated to a space well beyond the animal kingdom. We are thence made more civil, more sophisticated, and more advanced by the mere voyage into the abstract, despite the lagging qualities of the world before us and the dynamic, ever-changing qualities and tastes of the people who comprise it. So by the time of Keynes' death in 1946, just at the conclusion of World War II, and at the outset of the Cold War era, the Western world became officially fond of the Keynesian devices of government-induced stimuli in driving aggregate demand through a method known in economics as the multiplier effect, whereby government policy, whether fiscal or monetary, enables a direct and proportionate increase in government spending, which is expected in turn to both enhance the marginal propensity to consume, assuming an increase in disposable income, and accelerate an investment in infrastructure, machinery, employment, etc., which is then expected to stimulate consumer incomes and purchases. And again, we reach the multiplier effect. The multiplier effect, however, neglects the impulse and character of value-added productivity. Economic growth is born not out of consumption or mere demand, but rather out of underconsumption, savings, and creative design, which altogether blend into disciplined investment directed at harvesting profits through unique and effective applications of factors of production, otherwise known as land, labor, and capital. The expansion of consumer credit, some mainstream economists contend, signals growth in the optimism of the consumer, who now feels confident enough to take on larger debt loads. Whether or not the consumer feels confident enough to take on these debt loads, the net economic outcome is the same, something I explained in my article entitled Counter-Cycle Theory of Exchange, which may be found in the link attached to this podcast. Ultimately, this means a drain on available capital to otherwise disciplined capital investment to finance the here and now at the expense of the future. For all present consumption occurs at the expense of future consumption, and against the unseen increased standard of living attending higher future productivity. After all, the overarching objective of investment, and principally the idea of debt financing, is to increase the efficacy of modes of production to enhance profitability, which then justifies the interest on the loan and then offsets the immediate costs imposed on future consumption. Consumer credit fails to achieve any remote semblance of this objective, merely financing present demands with hardly any sensitivity for, on the financer's side, the grave potential for real loss, and on the borrower's side, the relatively unseen costs of funds locked up in a depreciating asset that bears no or little influence on the productivity of that consumer. So in the end, the growth in consumer credit, much like the federal government's debt ceiling, signals much more than the ravenous appetite of the American consumer. It signals a macrocosmic shift in the psychology around the nature of wealth and a distorted view of progress whereby YOLO investing, otherwise known as debt financed consumption, is good, and profits and productivity are for nerds or elitists who are unlikely to join the party at Coachella and whose funds should therefore be taxed or siphoned away to replenish the punch bowl and keep the consumer party going. Ultimately, Keynes would be the guy sporting the bro tank with his drink in the air shouting, "In the long run, we're all dead."